In the first part of this demo, we created our knowledge base and the invoice transaction to store the billing system data. Now we will have Genexus create the database and generate the application for us. To do so, we press the Run button. We will give a name to our database, the server where we want it to run, and a username to connect to it. Now, Genexus shows us an impact analysis of what we have done on the database and asks for our authorization to create it. If we take a closer look at the report, here it indicates that it will create an invoice table corresponding to the invoice header and an invoice detail table where the invoice detail lines will be stored. Genexus even shows us the SQL sentence that it will use in the process. To continue, we press Create. Genexus starts by creating the programs that generate the database structure. Next, it executes them in a process called reorganization. During the specification, it verifies the model's objects and shows the result in a navigation report. Lastly, it writes the source code in the programming language that we have selected and compiles it and executes the application. Here, we can see the application running. Note that since it is a web page, the browser was opened by default. Genexus executes the developer menu with a link to the invoice transaction that we had created. We will enter an invoice. We leave the identifier empty because it is auto-numbered. We select today's date and the client, John Smith. John wants to purchase 3 mouses at $10 each. Note that the line total and the invoice total were automatically calculated with no need to refresh the page. Genexus accomplishes this using AJAX technology. In this case, the formulas were calculated at the local or client level without sending any data to the web server. Let's enter a second invoice line. The client now wants to purchase 2 PCs. So we confirm the invoice. Through this selection icon, we can see that we've just entered an invoice with today's date for John Smith. We may also use the navigation buttons to see the invoice that we have entered. Now, let's suppose that we show this to the person in charge of invoicing, and he likes it very much. However, he would like the system to always suggest today's date instead of having to enter the invoice date, because he always makes invoices with the current date. In addition, the system should not let him enter a product line with 0 product quantity. This business rule mentioned by the customer can be added to the transaction object by programming this behavior in a declarative way. Let's go to the IDE to do this. We return to Genexus, and in the rule selector of the invoice transaction, we will add the first rule to give it a default value to the date. We write the default rule, or we can also select it here from the snippets or sample code. And here, we enter the attribute to which we want to give the default value, invoice date. And now we will give it the default value, a system variable called &today. Note that upon typing ampersand, the defined variables are displayed. Now let's add the second rule. It's an error rule, but since I don't remember how to write it, I just enter error and press tab, and Genexus helps me to complete it. I enter an error message, that says the product quantity is empty, only when the product quantity, invoice detail quantity, is empty. Note that I never define when these rules should be executed. In fact, Genexus determines the right moment when they should be triggered. Let's execute to apply these changes. And in this way, Genexus generates the application, including these rules that we've just entered. Let's enter another invoice. Again, the ID is not important. Note that it suggested today's date, and I can always change it if I want to. Let's enter another customer called Anna. And Anna wants to purchase 2 printers. That cost $50. But as you can see, when I leave the quantity field empty, I get a message saying that it's an error. Here, Genexus determined the moment in which this rule should be triggered with no need for me to tell it when to do so. We will add a value other than 0 to continue. The customer will also buy an LCD monitor that costs $200. We confirm. Note that the data was saved in the database, and thus we can see the invoices entered so far. Very good. The person in charge of invoicing was very satisfied with our changes, and starts to enter invoices. However, other people in the company tell us that they use a product catalog and a client catalog. So, the idea would be to enter the customers and products in different screens, and then choose at the moment of making the invoice. To do so, we will go to the IDE and see it in the next video.